How did you as a scientist come to focus on climate change as your emphasis?
Well, that's a good question. And really, in a nutshell, the reason I'm a climate scientist is because I'm a Christian, not despite it.
Okay.
So I grew up in a home where my dad was a science teacher, but he was also one of the teachers in our local church. And so the perspective I had is that if the Bible was inspired by God and the universe was created by God, how could studying either one of them possibly contradict each other? And if they appear to, isn't it because of our limited human understanding rather than any flaw with what we believe God created? But what really changed my whole perspective and ultimately my life was when I learned that climate change is not only an environmental issue. Climate change directly affects people's health. It affects their food and their water. It is making poverty and hunger and disease worse. And even though it affects all of us, it affects the poorest the most, the ones who've done the least to contribute to the problem, and the ones who Jesus tells us and the apostles tell us again and again that we are to love and care for. So to me, I realized, what is climate change other than a failure to love our neighbor as ourselves? And that led me as a scientist to realize that I wanted to do everything I could to help make a difference, not because I was a scientist, but because I was a Christian.
So when you introduce yourself or people discover that you are a climate scientist and an evangelical, how do they react? Is it, oh, of course you're a climate scientist because you're a Christian, or is it you get the weird glances and who reacts more, your scientific colleagues or your fellow evangelicals? What are the kind of the responses you get?
Well, the answer is 100% B on that one.
Okay.
A lot of weird looks and a lot of, are you a unicorn in the sense of, are there any more of you out there? And actually, there are quite a few of us out there, but a lot sort of lay low. For a long time, I wasn't really telling anybody I was a Christian because I was sort of thinking as, my faith is my personal life and climate change is my professional life. But when we moved to Texas and when my husband began to pastor a church here in Texas, and when people began to find out what his wife actually did, they started to ask him questions because they wanted to be polite. They didn't want to come right up to me and say, are you advocating for a one world government and the Antichrist?
Yeah. Our pastor's married to a witch. What are we going to do?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they figured they would ask him. And so he would come home with all of these questions like, how do we know it's actually humans causing it? Hasn't the world been warmer before? Why does it matter to us? Isn't it just about the polar bears? What are we supposed to do about it? Wouldn't it destroy the economy to fix climate change? And so I realized, there's no resource out there. This was a while ago. There's no resource out there I can really point them to that explains this. So I figured maybe I should write a book about how do we know it's real? Why does it matter to us as Christians? Why do I care about it because I'm a Christian? What can we do about it that makes sense, that actually helps people, that lifts people out of poverty instead of pushing them further down, that shows love for others instead of judging and condemning them and stepping on their heads? So my husband outlined what needed to go in the book. And in some cases, I was like, are you sure we need to say that? And he's like, yes, trust me, we do need to talk about that. And then I wrote it, and then we published this book called Global Warming Facts for Faith-Based Decisions for Christians. And I was really nervous that, in fact, I was so nervous it almost, without minimizing this, it almost felt like, almost coming out of the closet because
You're right.
I thought I was going to be flushing my scientific career down the toilet. And I had invested everything I could in my scientific career, and I thought, I'm going to be blackballed. I mean, this is it for any hopes I had of being an influential scientist. But I thought it was so important I had to do it anyways. So I got out there and I started telling people I care about this because I'm a Christian. And I have to tell you, I was so wrong. I so misjudged my scientific colleagues. I started to have people coming up to me at scientific conferences saying, I just saw you had a book out. I recommended it to our church. and it turns out that 75% of scientists at top research universities in the US believe in a higher power. They're theists. 50% self-identify as belonging to a specific religion. But sadly, most of us don't go to more theologically conservative churches because we don't feel welcome.
Right.
Well, so sorry,
Go
just
ahead.
to conclude that. So I even had scientists coming up to me saying, I don't share your faith, but I support what you're doing.
Yeah.
But I can count now, after 10 years, I can count on my 10 fingers the number of scientists who have condemned me for being a Christian. I need all my fingers and all my toes to count the number of Christians who condemn me for being a climate scientist on a weekly basis. And it breaks my
Oh,
heart.
it breaks my heart. Where do you think it went wrong? It sounds like you benefited from growing up in a home where science and faith were not positioned as combatants, right? They were unified. Your father was a scientist. Your father taught Sunday school. Um, but in so many Christian communities, it's just assumed that science and faith are in some way incompatible or at odds with each other. But when it comes to specifically climate change, is that what led to the breakdown, the assumption that science and faith were in opposition, or was it less about our faith commitments and more about Christian political commitments that
Mm-hmm.
led to this tension on this issue?
Both were in play, but I would say that the idea that science and faith are in conflict was the well-trodden pathway that allowed the politicization of Christianity and the politicization of climate change to gallop unimpeded down that pathway.
Hmm.
And you've probably read The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind.
Of
by Mark.
course. Yeah. Mark Knoll's been on the show too.
Oh my goodness. If anybody hasn't read that and they want the answer to your question,
Yeah.
that
Well,
book will answer that question. He takes it all the way back to the American Revolution. He talks about how there was political motivations related to the rise of fascism and Nazi Germany and in the Scopes trial. And at the end, he just starts to mention how climate change is basically, like I said, trampling down this well-trodden pathway. But I would pair The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind with another book called Merchants of Doubt. And Merchants of Doubt is not a Christian book. It's written to show how the fossil fuel industry hired the same spin doctors that allowed the tobacco industry to continue for so many years unimpeded, to convince people starting in the 1990s using very sophisticated communication techniques that climate change is not real, that the scientists are just lining their pockets with government grants, and that would destroy the economy to fix this thing. There was a concerted, intelligent effort to convince us that this thing wasn't true.